Again, welcome to our webinar series, Spotlight on Structured Literacy. My name is Kim Day, and I am the Vice President of the IDA Georgia Board of Directors. On behalf of the boards of IDA and Reading League Georgia, we're pleased to be offering this webinar series for the third year. We're joined this evening by Tina N. Burk. Tina is a state leader with Decoding Dyslexia Georgia, a consummate advocate for individuals with dyslexia, not only in Georgia, but across the nation. And she also served on Georgia's Dyslexia Task Force. In a few moments, Tina will be introducing this evening's speaker, Dr. Kymyona Burk. So welcome, Tina. IDA, the Reading League Georgia, and Decoding Dyslexia Georgia are committed to providing information on evidence-based practices to educators, parents, and advocates. In doing so, we hope all students will have access to structured literacy instruction. In this four-part series, our speakers have and will discuss how to most effectively instruct literacy based on the science of instruction and from the science of reading, what content to include to ensure students become competent readers and writers. In our first webinar in the series, Aligning State Literacy Policies and Practices, we learned about the efforts in Georgia to move policy to practice to improve literacy outcomes for all our students. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Kymyona Burk, will talk with us about lessons learned from Mississippi's journey to improving literacy outcomes for all students. Before we begin, one reminder, I want to thank those who submitted questions when you registered for the webinar. As a reminder, if you have other questions, please put them in the chat box. The chat will be monitored this evening by an IDA Georgia board member, Dr. Lama Farhan. Our speaker will address as many of your questions as she's able to during the Q&A. So now, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Tina N. Burk.
It's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. Dr. Kymyona Burk is a Senior Policy Fellow at Excel in Ed. In this role, she supports states pursuing a comprehensive approach to K-3 reading policy by assisting state leaders in building new or improving existing K-3 reading policies, with a heavy focus on supporting successful policy implementation. Kymyona most recently served in Mississippi as the Executive Director for the Jackson Public School District's Office of Teaching and Learning, and led all aspects of the district's instructional programming. Prior to this, she was the State Literacy Director at the Mississippi Department of Education, where she led the implementation of Mississippi's Literacy-Based Promotion Act. Kymyona began her career as an elementary reading teacher and has also taught middle and high school English. At Jackson State University, she earned a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science, Master of Arts in Teaching English, a Master of Science in Education Administration and Supervision, and a Doctor of Education in Early Childhood Education. This past year, she played an important role in the Right to Read film. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kymyona Burk.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. And I'm just so excited to any opportunity that I get to share about Mississippi's journey. And of course, ways in which we can really discuss some of the things that we have learned throughout this journey, and to be able to support states that have recently adopted early literacy policies like Georgia has, and of course, a lot of other states across the country. So tonight, I'll talk about Mississippi's journey to improving literacy outcomes for all students. I first want to just give some statistics around why third grade is considered the threshold for students as they transition from learning to read to reading to learn. The Annie E. Casey Foundation's research says that students who are not reading proficiently in third grade are 4 times more likely to not graduate from high school. If African American or Hispanic, 8 times more likely to drop out or fail to graduate from high school. and if low-income minority are 8 times more likely to drop out or fail to graduate from high school. And other statistics show that 88% of students who fail to earn a diploma were actually struggling readers in 3rd grade. And I think that this is the perfect time, opportunity to level set that although many of these laws that are being passed across the country are referred to as 3rd grade reading laws or read by 3 laws, that these efforts do not just fall on our 3rd grade teachers. This is not just a 3rd grade teacher's responsibility. We want to ensure that our kindergarten, 1st, 2nd grade teachers, and of course, even pre-K, for those students who have access to early learning, that students are being identified early and also being provided with the supports that they need in order to become skilled readers by the end of 3rd grade, to be able to be promoted to 4th grade and be able to access that material and the complex texts that come along with that transition and crossing that threshold. So I want to start by saying, it's read by 3rd grade, but again, we're all in this together, especially the accountability that is in the lower grades to ensure that our children are where they need to be by the time they reach 3rd grade and being promoted to 4th grade. Which brings me to this extremely important point about struggling readers. Children who are struggling readers will grow into adults who struggle to read if we do not intervene, if we do not provide the interventions that they need, the opportunities for preventative measures, and being able to document our supports and ensuring that we are aligning those supports with students' needs. Children who are struggling readers grow into adults who are struggling readers. And a study that was done with the Barbara Bush Family Foundation and Gallup in 2020 showed that the nation could be losing up to $2.2 trillion annually due to low adult literacy rates. I've spoken to several business leaders across the country during their roundtables, and they all talk about their investment in early childhood and early literacy efforts as well, because what we do in these early years in our preparation for our students as they exit high school, it directly impacts how well they are prepared to enter the job force. And to also be skilled workers in whatever career or opportunity that they choose. So as we think about education and we think about the economy and its impacts, I also want to think about how being a struggling reader or not being able to access text, different forms of media, can impact a child's daily life. And think about when we were in elementary school, all the things that we say as teachers, also to children about reading directions to complete their homework. Get your directions from the board, write those directions down, reading and solving math problems. So those things impact students in class. But think about, how they may struggle to read or write a birthday card to their classmates, or even to their family members, to their cousins, right? So those things can also impact their daily lives. And those students who are elementary school students who have difficulty, if there's no intervention, then they become adolescent students who have reading difficulty, who may have issues or challenges with following instructions for a science experiment, or even passing a driver's license test. And at 16, many of our children are looking to get their first job, and they have to fill out job applications. And then, without intervention, they become adults, many of whom will have families. They may struggle to read their child a bedtime story. And I think sometimes as educators, we take for granted when we say to parents, oh, read to your child 20 minutes a day, or read with your child 20 minutes a day, and not taking into account some of the adults who may be struggling to read themselves. They also may have issues with reading a ballot to vote, participating in the democratic process, and even completing paperwork for themselves, for doctor's visits, insurance claims. So I want us to really think about just our role in impacting the lives of children and impacting the trajectory of their lives. The work that we're doing can impact the trajectory of children's lives. And so this is very, very important work. And again, I'm just excited for you all to join us this evening to discuss it. One thing that I found, especially in Mississippi, the poorest state, considerably the Blackest state, is that many students are struggling to learn to read because of a lack of access and opportunity, not a lack of ability. Some of our children who are in under-resourced areas or do not have access to teachers who may have been trained in the science of reading or other resources. Many of our students lack access and opportunity and not ability. And this is where we come in. So why now? There has been so much talk about the science of reading, and this has really ramped up within the last 5 to 6 years or so. Now, we've talked about the reading wars, in the sense that there's this balanced literacy or whole language group, and there are those who believe in phonics. And I think that in some cases, it has really just come down to that. But one thing that we know about the science of reading is, of course, that it's not just phonics. It's language comprehension, it's oral language acquisition, it's vocabulary, it's fluency, it's all of those things, and phonics, the phonological awareness, the decoding, and all of those things that come together to build skilled readers so that they can comprehend. So why now? Some of these most recent forces behind science of reading momentum, especially across the country, I always kind of attribute it to 2018, Emily Hanford's Hard Words, Why Aren't Kids Being Taught to Read? And during this podcast, Emily really spoke to not just educators, because we know these things. We understand that we've been in classrooms and we see that our children are struggling. But she really also spoke to parents, to researchers, right? To those who are interested in any way as a stakeholder in education. And these conversations began to be had at dinner tables or among friends, or have you heard Emily Hanford's podcast? And then the conversation was around, wow, well, my child is coming home and it seems as if he or she has learned how to read this book, but they're calling words or they've memorized these words. And that means that they're really not reading. And so the stakeholder awareness widened from not just those of us who were in education or educating children. It began to be broadened to the community. And there was a lot of interest around, okay, well, what does good reading instruction actually look like? And then in 2019, on the heels of this, the NAEP fourth grade reading scores came out, and it showed that 35% of nation's fourth graders scored below basic in reading. And then Mississippi was the only state to see statistically significant gains in fourth grade reading. And so we began getting all of these calls to say, well, what is Mississippi doing? And I'll talk in a bit about our passage of the Literacy-Based Promotion Act and all of the components that have to work together to be a comprehensive approach. So we passed our law in 2013, but it wasn't until 2019 that we began to see kind of this national recognition, because within the state, we saw that we were making gains along the way. But this particular year, Mississippi was the only state to see these significant gains in fourth grade reading. And then that sparked really another conversation around, okay, if Mississippi can do this with being under-resourced and the other things that are going on in the state, then why can't we all do this, right? How can we really begin to close this gap that we've talked about forever, this achievement gap? How can we begin to close this achievement gap for all children? And then the pandemic happened. And the school closures, and it just depends on where you were within, in which state, in which district, right? Whether you had school closures, disrupted learning loss, the lack of access to technology to even learn online or with virtual learning. So there were so many things that exposed so many inequities across our country. And states have been bouncing back from that. And so 2022 post-COVID, we saw that now not 35%, but 39% of our nation's fourth graders scored below basic in reading, which really sounded the alarm yet again on why we have a crisis, really, in literacy across the country. And then Emily Hanford sold a story, how teaching kids to read went so wrong, and it focused on the curriculum that's being used in schools and also methods, strategies for teaching that include 3Qing. So I'll talk a little bit about those things in a minute. So at least 32 states have passed laws to align instructional practices with the science of reading. So you are in great company. The Virginia Literacy Act was passed a couple of years ago. And then last year, they extended that to include 4th through 8th grades. Because one thing that we do know is that there are children who are sitting in middle school classrooms who are struggling to read. And we need to be able to support those teachers to support those students in building and strengthening their foundational skills. Arkansas recently passed the LEARNS Act, which is a very comprehensive bill that focuses on a broad range of things as far as curriculum aligned to the science of reading and all the other supports that support skilled reading. West Virginia recently passed their 3rd grade Success Act for kindergarten through 3rd grade, but they're also including a focus on mathematics instruction. Kentucky creates a new statewide reading research center that was formerly aligned to balanced literacy, but now it is aligned to the science of reading and requires, rather than allows, superintendents and public charter school boards to adopt a common comprehensive reading program. Require, that word is very powerful in legislation. That and shall, right? They're very powerful in legislation. North Carolina, most recently, they passed a law in 2021, a comprehensive law around the science of reading, which includes requirements for educator preparation programs to ensure that they're aligning to the science of reading. And their recent budget eliminated 3Qing reading instruction, not only from pre-K to 3rd grade classrooms and curriculum, but also in educator preparation program coursework, where they cannot use instructional materials in EPPs that are aligned to 3Qing. And then Georgia passed its Literacy Act. And of course, I know that the previous webinar that you all attended spoke specifically to all of the things that are included in Georgia's Early Literacy Act and all of the things that are supporting that, not just with screeners for the universal reading screeners, but also any supports around dyslexia and being able to communicate with parents and include parental engagement. And then lastly, South Carolina. South Carolina has had a literacy law, and they are working to improve their law, and they also recently eliminated 3Qing. So you say, with all of these states passing these laws, how does that translate into improved student outcomes? Well, here's some policy implementation impact from 4 of those states. Florida passed their literacy law in 2002. They also have a 3rd grade retention component. And since then, in 2022, the most recent NAEP assessment, Florida has ranked 3rd. They ranked 3rd on NAEP 4th grade reading. Their African American, Hispanic, and low-income students rank in the top 3 in the country for 4th grade reading. Since Mississippi passed its Literacy-Based Promotion Act in 2013, we've improved from 49th on NAEP in 2013 to 21st in 2022. Our African American, Hispanic, and low-income students also rank in the top 5. And our third grade students now are performing at a higher level on our state assessment than pre-pandemic. North Carolina overhauled their Read to Achieve law and passed their Excellent Public Schools Act. But in the second year of their teacher training on science of reading, their mid-year K-3 screener data demonstrates growth in all subgroups and higher results than other states and districts that are using the same assessment, and they use Amplify. And in South Carolina, they adopted Read to Succeed in 2014, and they have maintained pre-pandemic NAEP fourth grade reading skill score of 216 pre-pandemic and also 216 post-pandemic. And so why do I share this data? I share this data because, and I will mention it a little later, but this success that some states are experiencing, and for Mississippi, we're not calling it a miracle, we call it a marathon, because it continues, and success is never final, depending on how you define it. Success is still never final. As long as you still have students who struggle to read or need those additional supports, success itself is never final, but you can improve and you can make growth. And so I want to share this data and this impact of policy, because I know that change is hard, and it's uncomfortable. But the outcomes are so great when it comes to the lives that we're impacting. So I just want to make sure that we keep that top of mind, that we're impacting lives and that these outcomes can happen. So change is hard, but necessary. And this is the Mississippi story. I wanted to include this image because who would have thought, right? Mississippi has been at the bottom of every educational ranking as long as there has been educational rankings in this country. So to be featured in the New York Times, especially around education, was something that we know did not happen overnight, but we know that we're moving in the right direction. And the title, Mississippi is offering lessons for America on education, we think is just really a great backdrop to our story. Education reform, and this is what so many of us have experienced in different times, especially if you've been in education for a while, you already know, right? There have been all of these different reforms. And so it comprises any planned changes in the way that a school or school system functions, from how you teach to the administrative processes. And some of the things that we did here in Mississippi actually involve infrastructure at our State Department of Education. But for those of you who are in schools, school districts, there are some things that you are doing as well, as a result as a result of the law being passed, to ensure that you're able to respond to what the requirements of the law are asking you to do. So I wanted to highlight 3 different laws that were passed within the last decade or so. I want to first start with dyslexia. We've actually been addressing dyslexia through certain efforts since the late 90s. And in 1997, I'm on this slide going kind of from the bottom up, but in 1997, Mississippi began giving dyslexia grants on a small scale that provided 3-year grants to districts to support students with dyslexia and or related disorders. And these grants would provide funding for the screener, dyslexia interventions, resources, other assessments, professional development, and up to 80% of the dyslexia therapist's salary. We do have a shortage here, not just on teachers, but also on specialists who support children in schools. So an incentive for schools to be able to hire the staff that they need. In 2012, Mississippi passed legislation around dyslexia scholarships that required local adoption policies, requires like the local education agencies to adopt those policies that would screen students for dyslexia in kindergarten and first grade. So our law says that students must be screened at the end of kindergarten and at the beginning of first grade for characteristics of dyslexia. And of course, at any other time where a teacher or parent feels that the student needs to be screened. These scholarships also provide funds for students to attend special purpose non-public schools that may offer the OG-based instruction by a licensed dyslexia therapist 5 days a week. Most recently in 2021, Mississippi adopted a policy around just dyslexia awareness training. And it requires districts to conduct 4 hours of awareness training for dyslexia and other related disorders to all licensed educators and paras responsible for instruction. Awareness is a big part of being able to, as an educator, help to identify students who may have dyslexia or other related disorders. Because we don't want to be those in the classroom that say, well, the child's not getting it, and I just don't know what to do. You want to be able to be aware that there may be something else. There may be another reason why the child isn't getting it. And the earlier that we can identify that is the earlier that we can provide supports for those students. And these other 2 laws were actually passed at the same time. A lot of people talk about our Literacy-Based Promotion Act and our K-3 law, but we also passed the Early Learning Collaborative Act in 2013, which focused on pre-K. It focused on 4-year-olds, and Mississippi does not have universal pre-K. So this was the state's first effort to fund early childhood seats, 4-year-old seats. And it's a partnership that the entities have to come into agreement with. A Head Start, a public school, a nonprofit group as a lead partner, a child care centers, or another nonprofit organization that serves 4-year-olds. And with these grants, they are able to support those entities that are providing education to 4-year-olds. And then our Literacy-Based Promotion Act, which has a lot of key components that I'll talk about in the graphic that represents our early literacy strategies. But essentially, the Literacy-Based Promotion Act does away with social promotion, making sure that students are ready, that teachers are ready to receive these students, and that parents and families are engaged to be able to support students as they become skilled readers. I'm sure that many of these strategies look familiar to you because they're included in your Georgia literacy law. So the one thing that I wanted to do was to kind of divide them and look at this differently. Not look at this so much as the policy, but look at it as the measures. These are measures for prevention. These are strategies for prevention. When you are asked or required to attend professional development as educators, as teachers and administrators, this is building your knowledge. Literacy coaches in schools to support the transfer from theory to practice. Preparing our future teachers through their coursework and ed prep programs aligned to the science of reading, and even the assessment that they are asked to pass prior to becoming licensed. Screening students 3 times per year, beginning, middle, and end. Screening for characteristics of dyslexia, again, to identify early and provide supports. Monitoring progress, notifying parents early and often. You know, in some cases, parents aren't notified until the end of the school year that their child is not going to be promoted to the next grade or that their child is going to need additional help. We want to make sure that parents are notified early and often, and so that they can become a partner in our efforts to improve their child's reading outcomes. Resources for parents to use at home, high quality instruction materials for teachers in the classroom, And of course, eliminating 3Qing practices and materials. And if you think of all of these things as preventative measures, these are things that we should do with our core Tier 1 instruction that's differentiated to meet the needs of students. All of these things can be done to prevent reading difficulty in children. And then when we think about the other components around interventions, how do you document your interventions? Individual reading plans for students, evidence-based interventions, opportunities for summer learning, summer reading camps. And again, for some states, they have the promotion policies where promotion to third grade is based on a state assessment with multiple opportunities for promotion, and then also good cause exemptions for some students. So prevention and intervention for students. And this is the graphic that we reference a lot around our main strategies for implementing the Literacy-Based Promotion Act, because we know that passing a law is the first step, but implementation is key. So our implementation strategies includes educator training, all levels. We've trained faculty from our educator preparation programs, reading faculty through our statewide science of reading training. We have coaches for teachers in our lowest performing schools, literacy coaches, but now we also have math coaches. We have school improvement coaches. We have digital learning coaches and early childhood coaches. So we know that coaching has been really one of the strongest levers, in addition to building teacher knowledge, right, through training, that coaching has been very powerful in empowering teachers to transfer what they learn in the professional development into actual daily practice and daily instruction. And then early identification with students with screening, parent communication, making sure that we educate parents about the law, and also other things that they should know around what the screening report should look like. How do they read that? What questions should they be asking their child's teacher? How can they help with strategies at home? What are the testing dates, right? How many opportunities will students have to pass the third grade assessment? So all of these things, we have to make sure that we are intentionally communicating with parents, but then also with any other audience that we have. It has to be intentional. The messaging for parents may not look the same as the messaging for educators. It may not look the same as the messaging for our partners like Boys and Girls Clubs. So we have to make sure that we are intentionally creating communication and messages for our stakeholders. Individual reading plans are here, and also our focus and our messaging was always over prevention over retention. And that we can sometimes focus so much on a state that has a law around third grade retention that we forget that there are all of these things that should be done prior to third grade, which will lessen the chance that children will be retained as long as we identify them early, provide them with the supports that they need. So what are some actionable steps to advance early literacy? First, develop an implementation timeline. So whether you're someone at the state agency, whether you're in a district office, or whether you're at a school, you have to develop an implementation timeline, and other people have to know about it, right? It has to be a shared experience where expectations are understood. This is when we plan to implement that. We're going to adopt a new curriculum, and we plan to implement it next year. This is a great part to talk about a runway. You know, sometimes we are, whether it's a school board policy or state law, that may say this is going to go into effect July 1, and the expectations that we'll see it in classrooms in September or in August. And that does not provide a runway for teachers, for administrators, for the culture shift, right? For the shift in practices to take place. So we have to consider, as we are making these changes, if this is the year of implementation, then how do we backwards design that so that we can have the adoption and professional development so that teachers can become familiar with and comfortable with a new curriculum and the ways in which they should teach that. Provide support for students, teachers, administrators, and families to make the shift to the science of reading, and collect data and monitor implementation. So for each of these, I have maybe a slide or two that further describes it. And this is just an example of the implementation timeline that we had for Mississippi from the time that I was there, from 2013 until 2019, where we strategically put literacy coaches in school. And then we adopted a science of reading training also in the first year. Our promotion retention component went live in 2015. We had amendments in 2016 that addressed educator preparation program assessment, and then also individual reading plans were added, right? And in spring 2019, we increased our level for passing from level 2 to level 3. So we all understood this timeline, and so we had benchmarks. We also had goals, and we were able to reflect on and to refine, right, some of those things as well as we went along. And so strategies and supports for teachers and administrators provide the professional development, but ensure that teachers know the why behind the shift. You want buy-in. You want teachers who are standing in front of kids every day to understand why they're having to change their practice from something that they've been doing for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. They have to understand the why behind the shift. Utilize those instructional coaches to provide that job embedded PD and also feedback. Turn standard staff meetings into POCs, right? Ensure that there's time that teachers can plan. There's opportunities to focus on content or curriculum knowledge building. And then also there are opportunities to focus on analyzing student level data. I think we talk a lot in percentages, but one thing that we have to understand is that those numbers represent real kids. And we have to talk in names, and how can we move Kymyona from where she is to make sure that she's making growth and making gains. And then supports for students. Early identification, diagnostic assessments, tutoring, summer learning opportunities, other strategies for students, and then again, the individual reading plan. And for your supports for parents and families, provide outreach to promote parental engagement, help ensure that parents are helping to develop the individual reading plan, parental notification, and discuss the impact of school attendance on reading proficiency. And I don't know if we lift that out enough, is that we can be doing all of these things, but the children have to be in those seats. The children have to be there, right? So we have to, with parents and families, discuss the impact of school attendance as we're moving children towards reading proficiency. And then lastly, measure and monitor your progress, monitor the implementation. As a state, we were able to document these things in these different reports, but as schools, school districts, even systems, right? Whether you're in an ed prep program or a college system, make sure that you are monitoring and measuring your implementation, what your benchmarks are, how you've grown, what are the things that you've put into place and what your timeline is. So reflection and refinement equals growth. So these are our lessons learned. We did not have it all together when we first started. And I dare say there's just so much room to continue to grow. So we don't have it all together now, actually. We just are all committed to this state-led opportunity for us to move the state as a whole. So the first thing, lessons learned, be transparent, even if you don't have all the answers. People do not want to continue to be transferred from this office to that office to that office. Be transparent. We developed an FAQs document where we had questions compiled from all the questions that we were getting from our stakeholders. And this visual actually represents all these headlines during the first year of our law passing, where they talked about the policy. There was miscommunication. We didn't know which assessment we were going to use. Our standards, we had just transitioned from our curriculum, Mississippi curriculum test, to our Common Core standards. Educator preparation programs wanted to know, how did this impact them? Because we had been in these silos for so long that there's K-12 here and there's, colleges of ed here. And then there was anxiety. There was anxiety from everyone. There was anxiety for parents, for teachers, and how it was communicated to some students, right? So there was anxiety, especially district leaders, school leaders. There was anxiety everywhere. But we had to have this very strong communications effort so that we could begin to go directly to communities, talk to parents and families, have principals meetings, superintendents meetings, and just really allow them to ask us questions, and we answer those questions so that we all could be on the same page. Now, these are questions that I'll say parents want to know these questions. Teachers and administrators should be able to answer these questions, and school board policies should reflect these things. So when you think about these, ask yourself and your colleagues, if a parent asked you, what evidence-based literacy instruction and interventions are being used in your school? Would you know the answer to that? What types of support are offered to students who are struggling to read or write? Would you know the answer to that? Your administrators know the answer to that. And how are children with reading difficulties identified, right? So this should be common knowledge for those of you in the school, in your school district, in your systems, that you should be able to have these conversations with families around how students are being identified and how they're being supported. And so refine the process is needed. Implementation science just says we have to close the gap between what we know and what we do. So now that we know about the science of reading, and it has become this buzzword all across the country, we have to now put that into action, and we have to close the gap between what we know and what we do for students. Sustained practice. Do not expect results to happen overnight. You have to implement this initiative, though, consistently and comprehensively over time. And I'm sure you heard me say several things multiple times around identification, around parental supports, right? Because it's a comprehensive effort. And then addition by subtraction. Make room for what matters and subtract what overlaps or has been proven effective. Have you done kind of an audit of how many screeners even you're using in your school? Or how many different pieces of different curricula you're using at your school, and how it would be very beneficial if you had, one curricula with supplemental resources that all aligned to the science of reading, right? So think about the practices and what may be overlapping or has been proven ineffective, but for some reason, this is still a part of your checklist of things that you have to do. And so our strategy was simple. We invested in people, and our scores from 2013 to 2015, we actually had an increase of 5 skill score points. 2017, we increased 1 skill score point, and then in 2019, we increased 4 skill score points, meeting and tying with the national average for the first time in 4th grade reading. And then this is our post-pandemic rankings, where all of our students are ranked 21st for 4th grade reading, white students 11th, Black and Hispanic students 5th, and our free and reduced lunch children, they're ranked 2nd in the country. So I will leave you with this. Be the change. You have to change the culture. has to be a teaching, learning culture in your building, even though things may have been done the same way for a long period of time. Unless we're meeting the needs of 95% of our kids, we still have work to do. Also, change the perception. If you're at a state agency, change the perception of the agency, right? From this auditing arm, or we're only coming out if there's a problem, to we're here to support you in the ways that you need to be able to move students. And then also reject the blame game. You know, I used to hear things about, well, the colleges of ed, they aren't graduating students who are ready to teach on day one. And then the College of Ed will say, well, the schools aren't sending us children who can go directly into their college courses, right? We're having to do remediation for those students. But we have to reject the blame game. And we all have to see ourselves in student outcomes and not in silos. And then lastly, it's going to take this interconnected system from our legislature to our DOEs and colleges of ed, district superintendents and leaders, educators, administrators, and of course, our parents and families. So I'll stop here for question and answer. Thank you all for having me.
And thank you, Dr. Burk, for a wonderful presentation. Good evening, everyone. I am Lama Farhan. I am a professor of communication sciences and disorders at the University of West Georgia, and I'm also a member of the IDA Georgia Board of Directors. So thank you so much, Dr. Burk. And we have a few questions that were submitted by participants. So we'll start with the first one. The first one says, has Mississippi done anything to address early literacy at the preschool level?
Yes, so I mentioned the Early Learning Collaborative Act that passed in 2013 alongside our Literacy-Based Promotion Act. During that year, 2013, 2014, our state invested $3 million, just $3 million in pre-K. And since then, in the enrollment, as far as access for students at that time, was around 38%. And now it is up to 58%. And the funding for that has increased to $24 million this last legislative session, that's dedicated to 4-year-olds, pre-K. So we have seen a lot of growth in our data. We have a kindergarten readiness assessment that's also given to pre-K students pre and post. And what it shows is that our students who are in early learning collaboratives with the coaches for their teachers and the professional development, that those students are outperforming students who are in regular, maybe a Title I pre-K that's not a part of a collaborative, and that they are meeting and exceeding the readiness score for kindergarten.
Okay, well, thank you. The second question says, how did Mississippi address issues with the balanced literacy group, particularly in higher ed, to get the law changed and require changes in curriculum?
You know, higher ed came late to this effort for us. And we, like most systems, have the academic freedom. And the higher ed, they have their own kind of accrediting body and all of those things. But our Department of Education approves programs for higher ed. So through our board policy, through our State Department of Education, we were able to make changes to course content, course requirements. But then also in 2016, we passed a law that said that candidates who were teaching elementary education had to pass an assessment of the science of reading. And so now there was this accountability in higher ed that we hadn't had before. But again, this accountability was now on students. But what happened after that, when we started receiving the data, and that we did initially have candidates who did not pass the assessment, then there became this larger conversation with educator prep faculty around how can we improve or increase your knowledge in the science of reading. And then we started with cohorts of ed prep faculty who began taking our letters training to improve their knowledge. Yes.
Okay, thank you. And the next one, what are 3 immediate must-dos tomorrow?
Tomorrow, if you don't know about the science of reading, learn about it. If your district isn't offering it or your state isn't offering it, there are so many free resources or webinars or modules around the science of reading and what it means to teach children to read and why some children have difficulty learning to read. So I think the first thing would be kind of increase your knowledge, increase your own knowledge. You know, especially administrators. We talk so much about teachers, but administrators are the ones who are holding teachers accountable, right, in their schools for making this shift in practice. So they need to know what they're doing in order to do that. Also, make sure that you're using the right assessment to identify children who may have reading difficulty. Assessments matter. Screeners matter, because if they're not assessing the right things, you may think that your children are doing fine. When in actuality, there may be some students who are struggling. So build your knowledge, identify the right screener so you can identify kids early. And I think lastly, your curriculum, what you're using in your classroom. If it's not the right thing, talk to your administrator about it. Get together with your colleagues and say, we've learned about the science of reading, but our curriculum doesn't align to that. So how can we have access to resources? And I know that there are free resources online that a lot of districts actually across the country are using some of the curriculum that are free.
Okay. What are the key levers we must pull for Georgia to see the outcomes that Mississippi saw?
Well, I think that literacy coaches, I've seen is a part of your efforts to improve teacher knowledge and practice. I think that literacy coaches in a very coordinated way to support teachers in schools, in classrooms, that has been, and I mentioned earlier, one of the most impactful levers for us. So I think that along with building teacher knowledge, putting coaches in classrooms to support them and creating those relationships. But I also think about guidance. If you're at the state agency, I'm talking to you. Or if you're at the district office, I'm talking to you. You have to provide guidance. It can't be a free-for-all. It can't be, we're going to provide read at home plans, and it looks a certain way in Gwinnett County, and it looks a certain way in DeKalb County, and it looks a certain way, right? So there has to be a hub. There has to be a hub, whether it's at the state agency or district office, that's facilitating all of these different pieces, right? And making sure that they are moving and that those users, those people who are on the ground, that they have the support that they need to do it. Because it's one thing to say, we need a parent read at home plan. And then it's like, okay, well, you come up with what that's going to look like, right? And teachers like, I'm just trying to teach, so it's providing that support. We were able to do at our department. We have an office that's dedicated to the implementation of the Literacy-Based Promotion Act. That's the goal of the office, right? So infrastructure is going to be extremely important in responding to that.
Okay. Well, you kind of talked about that, but the question says, what state supports were provided to districts to help teachers make the switch to science of reading-based instruction? So more specifically.
Yeah, I think one of the first things that we did at the state agency was we created kind of this at a glance document that was based on the legislation. Because when you open up the law, right, and you see all of these section this and all of that, for those who are actually responsible for doing the work, no one is thinking about reading through all of those things. What we were able to do was we created an at a glance document that specifically said, the state agency is responsible for doing these things according to the law. The district is responsible for doing this. The school is responsible for doing this, right? The parents are. So everyone was able to see themselves very clearly in the role that they play in implementing this law and improving reading outcomes, but then also able to hold others accountable, because they're like, okay, you're the district. You're supposed to be providing this thing, right? And I have to have this from you before I can move forward with what I'm supposed to do. So I think the at a glance document, first of all, and then secondly, we went through the law, and anything that required guidance or we felt would require consistency across districts, across the entire state, we developed it, because people needed to see what it looked like. Like for the individual reading plan, we developed a template. And then we had feedback from our teachers saying, well, we're already capturing this information in our MTSS documentation, right? Our multi-teacher system of support. So we're going to have to do it twice for the individual reading plan. And we said, you're right. So we made the IRP a portion of the MTSS document so that teachers would not have to do kind of double documentation. So you also have to listen to your people, right? You have to listen to those who are utilizing these resources. And when they say that there's a more efficient way, like, you have to take that into consideration. So I think that we kind of had our ears to the ground as it related to those who were on the ground doing the work.
Okay, and we probably have one more question, specifically about the screeners. Which, you did mention the screeners, but which universal screeners did you use?
Mississippi has a list of 6 screeners. We have a Mississippi reading panel as a part of our legislation that was convened, and the goal of the Mississippi reading panel is to choose screeners, approved screeners for the list. So we have criteria, and there are 6 screeners. Of those 6, though, the top 3 screeners are, I believe, iReady, Renaissance, STAR, and NWEA MAP. I believe those are the top 3. But if you go to Mississippi's website and you look, Mississippi Department of Education, and you look under Universal Screener and Diagnostic Assessment, then you'll see the list of 6 approved screeners, the application, and all of that. Because as the state agency, with our legislative appropriations, because funding is also important, with our legislative appropriations, we reimburse school districts for the cost of screeners, and they have to submit the screener data to the department.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Burk. Thank you again for a wonderful presentation. And thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. So if you have colleagues who have missed tonight's webinar, please let them know that all registrants will be receiving a link to the webinar, as well as the slides from this presentation. All registrants will also have the opportunity to fill out a knowledge check or request for certificate of attendance form after viewing the webinar live or recorded. That form will be sent early next week, and registrants will have approximately 1 week to submit the form. Those who fill out the form will receive the certificate of attendance the day after the deadline for submission. On behalf of the boards of IDA Georgia and the Reading League Georgia, we appreciate you attending our webinar this evening. We hope you all have a wonderful rest of your evening. We look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar in the series on February 28th with Dr. Nadine Gabb, who will talk to us about screening for dyslexia and other reading disabilities, the why, when, whom, and how. Thanks again, and have a good night.
Thank you. Good night.